Okay, so let's get started. So my topic for tonight is working on improving your Perl programming through subroutine signatures and type validation. Um, it's based on a blog article that I published a couple weeks back. Um, it's a little bit expanded. I haven't timed this, so I don't know how long it's going to take, but it probably shouldn't take any more than an hour, including questions. So, starting off, who am I? I'm a software developer at HostGator. I've been working in Perl for about 25 years now. I have a couple CPAN distributions to my name that need some love. They need some maintaining. I have to work on those. Baby steps, though. Um, Tonight, we're going to focus on making your code more reliable and readable. Hopefully, everybody's interested in that, um, especially in code that catches mistakes and errors early before it ships out to production. Um, we've got a bunch of different approaches to this particular topic. I'm going to be covering 6 of them. Plus, I did a quick survey of other ways to do it. This is very much like Perl. There's more than one way to do it. Towards the end, maybe we'll cover some favorites. Hopefully, people won't be asking, hey, why didn't you cover this module or that module or whatever? But we're all still learning here. So if I missed your favorite, then please, by all means, let me know, and I'll just improve the next version of this presentation. So I put out a survey this past week asking people how they unpack arguments when they're writing subs in Perl, and the majority. This is how most of us do it. We unpack the at underscore variable, just like the bar function on the slide that I'm showing right now. A couple other people also use shift, just like the foo function there. Um, Whatever, there's shift operates on the at underscore variable by default. So when it's in a sub, so that's perfectly fine too. Um, there were a couple that said they used other techniques. I didn't specify in the survey what those techniques might be. So maybe we'll see them in this presentation. Maybe we won't. Maybe if folks want to share what they do, um, I'd be happy to, again, expand the presentation. So the first thing we're going to cover is experimental signatures. And these are called experimental because they're labeled as such in Perl. When you want to use them, you have to use the experimental pragma to bring them in. It's funny that they're experimental because they've been in Perl core since 2014. They changed a little bit in 2016 in 524. But other than that, they've been stable for about 5 years now, even though they're still marked experimental. It's got the basic features that you might want when you're trying to specify what parameters your functions or methods want to take. You can, as you see in this foo function here in the slide, you can say I want a parameter You can say that you want a parameter with a default, that param2 equals 1. That'll set param2 to 1 if you don't pass one in. And you can even slurp in the rest of your values into an array, like I do with this rest array here in the function. It's called Slurpee. It's kind of a childish word, but that's what the documentation calls it. So that's what we're going to call it. And it works. It's a little bit cleaner than unpacking at underscore. You don't ever have to even touch it at underscore. It's a little bit more familiar to users of other languages, which specify method or function signatures in a similar way. Folks coming from JavaScript, Java, Python, even, they might see this and say, oh yeah, I get this. I mean, yes, you've got funny sigils at the front of your variables, but other than that, we're good. And this gets you pretty far the way there. It's again, though, it's experimental. There are plans to add more features to this, like type assertions or generic queries, named variables, etc. But that hasn't shipped yet. And there's been an effort to make them standard. Just this week, Paul Evans has been posting issues on GitHub and kind of making little dust-ups on Reddit and other places, trying to get them to be not experimental anymore so that people can use them and not have to justify to their boss that they're using an experimental feature. But as I said, some of those other features that people are working on for signatures aren't there yet. We don't have type validation, so you can't say that such and such variable has to be a number or a string, or even basic Perl types like a scalar or a reference, or specifically an array reference or hash reference or something like that. No, you just get to name the variables that come in. You also don't get named parameters. You can't pass in like a hash where the keys are the names of your parameters and the values get assigned to them or anything like that. So that makes more self-documenting code a little harder. Hold on just a second. I just went forward too much. But we do have some interesting things. You can do nameless parameters. So you can, like I have here in this foo function in the top right of your screen, that single $sign there, that just acts as a placeholder. If you want to be compatible with some other functions interface but throw away values, you can do that. Just put a little placeholder $sign in there. That makes it mandatory unless you set a default for it. You can also have expressions in your defaults, like in the bar function there. It has adds 1 to ID every time the function is called. So you can, this bar function says that param1, the thing that you pass into it, has an ID that increments every time. So that's kind of nice. You could make it have you can even have it use the parameters that you previously took in the call, such as the baz function there. You can, where it says hello param1 as a default for param2. That stuff works. The Slurpee things that we were talking about with arrays also work for hashes. You can take in a hash of as many keys and values as you like and slurp that in. Using this, you could do something like pass a code ref and a bunch of hash arguments for it to act on and work on it like that, like in the Quux function that I have on screen here. And for those of you who wonder about prototypes, which is a Perl feature for subs that not a lot of people use. Some people use it thinking of it as sort of like parameters, sort of like with types and things like that. They don't really act like that, but some people treat it as such. You can do that with an attribute. You have to put a colon prototype in there and then put your prototypes in parentheses. I just realized I have a typo on that line for QWX. That should be a parenthesis, not an open brace, but we'll fix that later. If you want to know about prototypes, read the Perl sub man page about that. I don't use them, but you might, so they're there. Any questions about experimental signatures before I move on? Any questions, observations, anything like that? Do we need to unmute people? Yeah, we're getting to that. We have a couple of bolt-ons modules that we can use, and we're spoiled for choice in a way. So let's go on to one of them. How about that?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I did not realize that signatures supported named parameters since it's supposedly light sugar just for using @_. So I wondered what type of calling formats would work, and it would treat it as named parameters.
I guess I wasn't clear there. There is no support for named parameters.
Oh, so these examples here, like where it showed QUX and then %arg, so that's not something that actually exists?
It does exist. You can pass in a hash and or a set of key value pairs, and they'll get assigned to arg. And you can use them just as you can in the body of that Quux function. But you're still going to have to validate whether you got the names that you wanted. There's no way to say, oh, I want an argument named Mark and I want an argument named Joe, and I'm going to throw an error if I don't get those arguments or if I get an argument that I'm not expecting.
Okay, you did partly answer it though. So either a hash ref or plain name value pairs will go into %arg then.
Yes.
Okay. That's all.
Okay, cool. Move on? Sure. So we have as George was asking about, we have a couple of what he called bolt-on options, modules that we can use to get more features. And the first one we're going to consider is Params Validate. This is by Dave Rolsky and Ilya Martinov, plus other contributors. One of the nice things about this one is it's very well tested. It's been around since 2001. And it has two functions that it exports by default, one called validate and another called validate pause. Validate gets you named arguments like Darren was asking about earlier, where you can have named parameters that you pass as a hash. And validate pause gives you positional arguments. That's where the pause comes from. In both cases, you're passing add underscore as the first parameter to validate or validate pause. And you can specify whether a given argument is optional or not, or I should say required or not, required being a true value of 1, optional being true value of 0. The foo function there and the bar function show you how to do it with both validate pause and validate. You've got, again, 1 for required, 0 for optional there. Validate pause will just do it with the positional arguments that you pass, while validate will, you set the names that you're expecting. So you've got name parameters finally, and you have basic Perl types. You can say, I'm expecting a type of scalar or array ref or hash ref or a Boolean, which reduces down to being either undef or a scalar, or a glob or glob ref, which, or a handle, or a bunch of other, or the others that I'm listing there on the screen. It will params validate will throw an exception if the if it doesn't like what you pass it. It'll say no. This, in the case of this baz function here, it'll say the first argument has to be a scalar. The second argument can be either a scalar or an array ref. The third argument has to be a hash ref. And if you pass it something that doesn't match, you get an exception thrown. But there's more. You can have what some people call duck typing, where you have to pass it an object that can do certain methods, such as this first call to validate here, where it says param1 has to be able to do can do the bar method, but you can also specify it's optional. That's an option you can pass, optional with the optional key, and then setting the value to 1 there. So in this case, instead of just passing a single 1 or 0 as the value for the hash that we're passing to validate, or the hash ref we're passing to validate, it's hash refs within the hash refs for can do this method, or can do a set of methods. You can pass a array ref of methods, and it'll check to make sure that they can do all of that. Hopefully everybody's here's familiar with hashes, hash references, lists of lists, array of hashes, all that kind of deep data structure stuff that Perl has. Anybody here need a refresher? Yes, no, hopefully no. If you do, there's a Perl DSC man page, Perl Data Structures Cookbook, that will hopefully answer all of your questions. So you can also, as in the second call to validate here on the screen, you can make sure that the object that you pass is of a certain class, or is of or matches a set of classes, again by an array ref, this time to the is a parameter. Like the third call to validate is, you can match it against a regex. You can even untaint the variable. Speaking of which, whatever happened to taint mode? I never see it anymore. Considering the amount of things, considering everything's a web app, and we're not supposed to trust input from the web, it seems kind of silly that we don't see it anymore. So again, you can untaint values that are passed in and set defaults. In the fourth call to validate here, I'm even making certain parameters depend on other parameters. CC number in this case on the fourth call to validate says it depends on CC expiration and CC CVV. In other words, if you pass it a CC number, a credit card number, you're also expected to have an expiration and a CVV code. In this case, we say that the expiration has to be also a date time object. So as you can see, you can get pretty powerful, not only subroutine signatures and unpacking of arguments. You can do some pretty powerful type checking and validation right there at the beginning of your functions, and not have to write a lot of custom code to do it. It's all just taken care of for you by Params Validate. You can even set callbacks, and these are anonymous. They can be anonymous subs, or they can be references to code or something like that. That where you pass it a hash ref to the callbacks key there as like the first call to validate there, and you can give it a hash of code to call to do your own custom validation if none of the other options suit you. You can say, oh, the value that you pass has to be less than the value of the variable breadbox, which is what I've got there, and the first anonymous sub there. Or you can say, oh, it has to be a string that equals either green or blue. The code ref, it's given the value of the parameter, and it's given all the other parameters you get as a hash or array reference. So you could write your own depends logic if you want. The code ref that you give it has to return true if a parameter is valid, or return false or die if it's not valid. You would want to do die if you want your own custom string for the error message, as opposed to an error message that just includes the key for the hash that's being passed a callback. So, for example, that smaller than a breadbox thing will throw an error that says foo is not smaller than a breadbox. The die can also die with a reference, which will then be rethrown as an exception. So if you're using some kind of exception system where you have your own exception objects, that works too. The second call to validate demonstrates how you can make your validations depend upon other arguments that have been passed to your function. In this case, it's saying that the value that you passed to foo has to be greater than the value that you passed to bar. Any questions so far? Because this is Params Validate has got a lot of options, and we're not done with them yet. Okay, moving on. Validate Params Validate has a function called validate options where you can set some options for it to do when it's calling your validate and validate pause functions. These options are configured per package. So you have to call it in a in the package that you want it to apply to. If you're doing something with several several classes that inherit, or doing something with Moose or something like that, you're going to still have to call validate options in each package. This is generally just to make it so that the options don't pollute other packages usage. You have validate and validate pause, because you might be using things from CPAN or using things from other sources that also use params validate, and you wouldn't want your options to get set on those. So these options that you've got, you can normalize the keys that that are used for named parameters. You give it a sub, you give it an anonymous code ref, or you can give it a reference to another function or something like that. This can do things like remove leading hyphens, change the letter case so that regardless of whether somebody makes their named parameters capital or uppercase or lowercase or whatever, you'll still take them. Whatever you can imagine up, whatever you can express in code. You've got an allow extra option, which defaults to false, but you can set it to true. And what that means is it allows extra arguments that aren't in the specification that you pass to validate or validate pause. So if there are other things that are being passed that are going inside of @ underscore, it won't throw an error. It'll just leave them in @ underscore, and it'll be up to you to process them however you want. This is useful if you want to emulate built-in functions like map or grep, where you're passing an arbitrarily long list, where and it's not a reference to a list or something like that, but it's an actual list, and you want to allow extra arguments. So this kind of does what experimental signatures do with so-called Slurpee arguments. There's an on-fail option, which is a callback that will happen when validation fails. By default, it just calls carp confess. If you're familiar with the carp standard module. But again, you can make it die with whatever code you want. There's a stack skip option, which how many stack frames to skip when it's giving those error messages. This lets you say such and such failed at such and such level, so many functions back, or so many. So in this case, I'm in validate options. I'm setting it to 2, which says I don't want you to tell me that it failed with this function here. I wanted to tell it to fail with the function that called that function. There are also options called ignore case and strip leading that are deprecated. Those are basically subsumed by normalized keys. Anything you could do with ignore case or strip leading, you can do with normalized keys. Ignore case does the example that I described earlier, where you can change the case of the named parameters that you're passing. Strip leading would you could give it a set of characters that you want to be stripped from those named parameters, and it'll strip them. For example, if you had leading hyphens, which some I know some modules do it that way. When you pass named values, they want hyphens at the beginning of those options. And I'm showing that with the validate with function there. Validate with is a way of setting those options on a per call basis. So you can validate, instead of using validate or validate pause, you use validate with, and you pass the spec and you set the option that you want to set just for that one time, as opposed to the options that you want to set for the entire package. And as if that wasn't enough, you've got environment variables to control certain things. There's a Perl no validation environment variable, which, as might be expected, absolutely turns off validation. So things are just passed in without validate or validate pause getting in the mix and throwing exceptions if things don't match the specification. And you've got Params Validate implementation environment variable, which lets you select which module is going to be used for Params Validate. There's both a pure Perl and a XS version of the module. The XS one is faster. If you wanted to use the pure Perl version for some reason, maybe it's easier for you to do debugging, or maybe there were problems compiling the XS version, you could just use the pure Perl version by setting that environment variable. A lot of options. As I said, it's been around since 2001. It's needed to serve a lot of use cases, and it's kind of grown all these options to serve them. But it's just one of several we'll be covering tonight. Any questions before I move on to the next one?
Yes, Mark, on the validate options, that only, it sets these things like normalized keys or whatever, but does it execute these various things anytime you call one of the validate functions? Is that how that works?
Yes, that's how that works. So every time you call validate or validate pause, say you set normalized keys in validate options, that'll get executed. So on all of your keys, all your keys will get processed to do things like turn all caps into all lowercase, or if you set the option like strip leading, it'll strip those characters from the beginning of your options or whatever, but they'll run every time validate or validate pause is called.
Okay. Thank you.
No, it's not, but there's another module that we'll be covering that does that, and we'll also be covering type tiny.
What's the scope of validate options?
That, like I said, it sets options for params validate per package.
Okay.
So you're going to, if you've got several packages, several classes, however whether you're using packages for classes or not, you're going to have to set validate options for each of them.
Okay, thanks.
Moving on. Okay. Next up, we have MooseX Params Validate for the Moose fans. This is originally by Stephen Little and Dave Rolski, plus other contributors. I like to call it Params Validate with antlers. Hopefully, I'm not going to explain what Moose does. Moose is except to say Moose is a object system that you can use with Perl. It gives you a lot of things that you ordinarily would have to write a lot of code for. It does for you. So it's got advantages and disadvantages. Some places use them, some places don't. But for those of you that do, it exports 3 functions: validated hash, which is just like param validate, validated list, which returns things as positional values. So you can assign the results as a list, and pause validated list, which is just like params validate pause that I described earlier. And I'll show you some code examples on the next slide about this, but I wanted to cover the different things that these all take. They all take a specification where you can say that a given parameter is a certain thing, that it is a class name or a Moose type constraint name or a constraint itself. You can say it does a certain role, or, and again, an anonymous Moose type constraint. Moose has type constraints. I'm not explaining how they work is a bit out of scope for tonight, and we'd be here a lot longer. But I'll just say that it has them. Coercions. You can set a Boolean to say that a given type that you're validating against will coerce into other types. So, for example, you wanted a string that coerces into a more rigorous type, like say for a dotted quad IP address or something like that. And then there are default, optional, and depends options in the parameter spec, which act just like the ones that are used in Params Validate. So let's see an example. Here we've got a Moose package here, a Moose class called foo. It uses Moose and uses Moose-X Params Validate. And you've got a couple of methods on there. All of them are assigning to self, which is a common thing you do with Perl methods. The first value is always assigned to something like self or class if it's a class method. Note that when you're calling either validated hash, validated list, or pause validated list, you're passing a reference to @_. That's different from params validate, where you just pass @_. Also, it's worth noting that when these things fail a parameter check, it's going to throw an exception object. It's not just going to die with an error. It's got the exception objects have a really long name that I don't have memorized, but it's like Moose exception, blah blah blah. It goes several layers deep. So here in the first example for the foo function, we're using validated hash, which has a single named parameter called param1. We're saying that it is a string and it has a default of Moose. And it puts the results of that parameter checking into the params hash, where it's getting assigned via that my self comma params equals validated hash. The bar function, or the bar method, I should say, uses validated list, where instead of assigning to a hash, it assigns to a list of values. So param1 and param2 are just regular scalars that get assigned whatever comes out of the validation. Param1 has to be a foo object. Param2 has to be either an array ref or a hash ref, but it's optional. In the BAS method here, we're going to use pos validated list. Worth noting here, pos validated list will not pass self to you because it can't tell if the first argument that it's getting is the reference to is the reference to the object that the method is being called on, or it's just a parameter that's being passed. So you have to shift off self manually there. But other than that, it acts kind of like validated list, except you're passing it a list of hashes. The first, in this case for the BAS method, the first parameter has to be a foo object, and the second parameter has to be a array ref of integers. If you want to explore the whole Moose types system to find out all the other things that can validate against, be my guest. It's very deep. You can define your own. This would be how you would do the kind of params validate style of validating against a arbitrary code ref, except in this case you would set up your code ref as Moose types. Worth noting is that this module is looking for a new maintainer. So if anybody here wants to step up, by all means, please do. Dave Rolski has put this on the list of things that he would rather not maintain. Actually, please do, because we use this at work and it would be nice to have a maintainer. Any questions about this before we move on? Okay, moving on. Next module, or bolt-on as George would say, we're going to cover is called function parameters. This is by a fellow by the name of Lucas May, or May, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. It's a little different, so buckle in. With function parameters, we get totally new keywords for defining both functions and methods. You've got fun, instead of function, it's just fun, and method keywords. The interesting thing about it is that if you use method instead of fun, you get the $self variable assigned for you. So you don't have to shift it, you don't have to unpack it, you just get it as a method. You get self for free. The syntax for it is a lot like the experimental signatures. You can just list the params that you want to set as variables. You can set defaults by saying such and such equals a certain thing. You can also say that you want a method that blesses things into a certain class. So you use that in the example of that method new example on my screen. This will give it a different name for the class that you want to bless a new instance of your parameters into. So maybe you're inheriting from a given class, but you still want to bless it into the parent class. This would be how you do it. Any questions so far? Because there's more.
Does this support using the keyword function as an alternative to fun?
No, sorry.
Too bad.
I'm sorry. But I'm sure maybe patches are welcome. I don't know. Um, you can have optional arguments. You just set the default equal to undef, and those parameters become optional. Or just say dollar variable equals, and that'll also work as saying something's optional. You don't have to type undef all the time. It's got Slurpee parameters, just like experimental signatures. So in the BAS function that I've got there, param1 gets assigned, param2 gets assigned, everything else goes into the rest array. And it's got named parameters, but it does a little differently. In this case, you precede the variables that you want to be named with a colon. So in that Quux function that I've got on screen, you would pass it a hash with a keys of param1 and param2, and they would get assigned to $param1 and $param2. You can also have unnamed parameters, kind of again like experimental signatures. It's just a single sigil, like a $sign or something like that. Worth noting, that's not a prototype. I know prototypes are declared the same way when you're using a sub, but again, this is using either fun or method, so it's specifying an optional parameter. Or not optional, unnamed parameter, sorry. And you have types. You can use the types that come with type tiny in the types standard module, or you can use moosex types moose. You can define your own functions that do type constraints. You can define your own type constraint objects. Example with the bar function I have down there at the bottom, it's saying that a given type is a new constraint class. A given type 2, my type 2 is another type constraint, and you pass those as leading values to the parameters, and those become your type constraints. Or if you just want to use the ones that are in type libraries, like in the foo function there, you just specify them like you would otherwise normal functions like str or arrayref of integers or something like that, or has methods if you want to do duck typing. In this case, the third parameter has to have a count and run. Worth noting as we've gone through these examples is, again, since it's using its own syntax, you're not going to get neat syntax highlighting in your editor or anything, or your blog post or anything like that, unless you write your own syntax highlighting code. So that's one disadvantage of using this. I'm not a fan of introducing new syntax via module for reasons like that. But again, if this is something you like, go ahead. Any questions about function parameters?
On your begin statement there, you say my type and my type 2, but just outside of the begin, you do a my on my type and one called another type. Is that a typo, a bug?
Yes, it is. I'm sorry.
That's fine. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't going insane there.
No, you're right. Sorry. You're right. That should say my type, my type two. That shouldn't say my type, my another type. I'm sorry about that. One other thing I just want to say about those your own type constraint objects. All they have to do, they just have to have a check method and a get message method. Check returns true or false, depending upon whether it passes the validation that you write, and get message returns the error string if they that you want to throw an exception with if the parameter doesn't pass validation. And again, this is all documented in the man page for this module. So don't take my word for it. Look it up. They probably do a better explanation than I am. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one.
Mhm.
Do any of these systems that you're reviewing support typed functions?
Where they return a certain type, like
Yeah, where you could say like foo accepts a function that takes a string and returns an integer.
no,
Okay.
no. With this is all type constraints on the parameters you're passing to methods or functions, not for the return values. Okay, so George, we're going to get to the thing that you mentioned earlier, type tiny, which, despite its name, has a lot of other modules that come along for the ride when you install it. It's only tiny in the sense that it doesn't. It has very few dependencies, and one of the modules that comes along for the ride when you install type tiny is called type params. This is by Toby Inkster. He's also a very prolific CPAN author. One thing to note about type tiny and type params is it's used by quite a lot of CPAN modules. So I also recommend it for new work. If you were asking what of all of these different options I recommend right now, this is it. What type params gives you is, I think it was George who asked earlier that it has this separate compile step before, so it's faster than params validate. You have a compile, like I said, you have a compile function where you take the specification that you want to validate your parameters against and assign that to a code ref variable. If you can then use something like Perl 510's state state statement. That's kind of a funny way to say it. To only set that variable once, only compile it once for speed. So you get that little bit of a performance hit at first, but then after that, it's lightning fast. It's already compiled. Types standard has a lot of type constraints. I'm not even going to try to cover all of them. It's got all the usual suspects like strings and integers, array refs, hash refs, but it also has tuples and what are they, like arrays of arrays and things like that. So it's got a lot. If when I circulate these slides, all of these things that are underlined have links to CPAN or Meta CPAN, and you can click on those and read all about that. as we can see with this foo function we have here, it's doing that compile step at the beginning where it's saying your specification first value has to be an object. The second parameter has to be a string, which defaults to world. The second one is hash ref of strings, which defaults to an empty hash ref. And then you've got it supports Slurpee parameters. It slurps everything else into an array ref of ints. And again, all of that is assigned to that check variable with state so that it only gets assigned once. And then you just unpack your variables normally. You call check, you dereference that code ref, pass it @_ and everything gets validated for you. Self goes into self as an object. You can then call I'm having a call a method here called hello where it's passing param1. Params ref got a hash ref of strings, so I'm looping over those and reporting what's in those. And then also printing out what's in the Slurpee array ref that came into rest ref. Any questions about this? It's building on a lot of things that we've covered in other modules, but it's a little different. And again, that compile step, that's the key advantage here of is speed. It's not having to execute that the validation code each time. It's compiled into a code ref for you.
Yeah, I think the compile is a cool option.
It is. Yeah, type libraries. Type tiny. That's again, Moose has types. Type tiny has types. And you can build whole libraries of those things that you then just use and bring in as functions that are then passed to the compile step.
Yeah, it's probably inaccurate to say it's not running the validation each time. Rather, it's just not interpreting the spec structure each time.
Yeah, you're right, not interpreting the spec structure. And that can be a hit because spec structures can get complicated.
I haven't seen the source code of this, but if I was implementing that, compile would basically just generate and then eval Perl code into a code ref. That looks like that's how it could be implemented.
Very likely. I haven't looked at the source either. Cool. So it's not magic. If you want to look into the source, it's all there. Type params has named parameters. You use the compile named function instead of just compile. There, it's just like a lot of what we've been doing for other modules. You pass it a hash. The keys are the parameter names you want. The values are the validation that you want to perform. In this case, param1 is an integer. Param2 is a string with a default. Rest is a Slurpee option of array of strings. And in this case, compile named will return a hash reference. Or not, I should say compile name returns the check code ref, but when you run that, dereference it against @_, you get that hash ref of parameters. And they both have a lot of options. You can pass a hash ref at the beginning of them. there's a head option, a tail option, a want source, want details, description, subname, caller level. Compiled name adds class, constructor, bless, named to list, named. I had this written as something else, named to list. Specs can have optional or default. I mean, read the man page, read the fantastic manual. It's got a lot to cover. You can one thing that's useful for debugging that I just mentioned, it has a want source option where instead of returning a code ref, it returns the source it would compile to as a string. So you can just spit that out as to your output or standard error and inspect the validation code that it generated. One other thing about type params, it has a neat trick where you can use this other function called compile named OO, where your parameters, instead of turning into hash keys, your named parameters, instead of turning into hash keys, will turn into methods. This is really nice because if you're just using hash keys, you might make a typo. You might say that my argument, I'm passing it a database handle. I named it DBH, but I tried retrieving it as DB, and it silently fails. This way, you'll get unknown method call. It'll tell you I don't know this method, and you'll instantly know that you've got an error. So compiled named OO, I'm using this in this add contact to database function. You pass it a DBI handle as the first parameter called DBH. You pass it a name and an ID, a string and an integer, and they will all get turned into methods for the argument reference that gets returned from check. So here I've got give me a state, the second to last line of this function, give me a statement handle where I'm preparing this SQL statement, and then execute it on, and the next line, execute it on these other arguments that I've turned into methods. You can even have, you can even tell it to use your own getter instead of your own method name, I should call it. It's a getter method instead of the parameter that you pass. So here I'm turning ID into identifier. And you can set predicates, like you can say has name. So if that optional parameter got passed, has name returns true. Again, this is really neat. It will catch a lot of errors. Any questions?
I'm not quite understanding the getter and the ID. Okay.
Okay.
You have, because like in DBH, you just say arg DBH. It's a function, a method, so you can continue calling into it because it returns an object, I guess.
Yes.
DBH object. But the ID, it says it's an integer.
Right.
So if I said $arg ID, would that be different than if I said $arg identifier?
Yes, I in this, because you're setting the getter to be identifier, that's going to be the method name that you use on arg to get that value. You will not be using ID. ID will not be a method.
Okay, so it's just replacing the name of the item.
Right.
Parameter. Right.
Exactly. Okay. It's replacing the name and turning it into another method name. I'm using this in here so that you can have shorter named parameters, but longer method names. Any other questions about type params? It has even more functions than this. I'll just let you know. It's type. It's. I'm just scratching the surface. It's got something for multiple specification signatures that I'm not covering here, just because if I was, we'd be here for another half hour to 45 minutes, and it's already 7:15. So I'm trying to move as fast as I can. Okay, moving on. Params Validation Compiler. Dave Rolski again, the guy who wrote Params Validate. If you look at the top of Params Validate, you'll see that he says he doesn't actually recommend that. He recommends using Params Validation Compiler for speed. And you'll see why. It's just kind of like Params Validate. It's like if Params Validate and type params had a baby. It's got a separate compilation step like type params, but it's called validation 4 in this case. And also it can get its types from type tiny, moose, or specio, which are pretty much cover the three main type library systems on CPAN. It also can accept additional Slurpee arguments, and it has a named to list option to have named arguments return a list of values instead of just a hash. So here in this code example, we're doing a lot of stuff that looks just like type params. We're compiling a specification into a state variable called validator in the foo function. It takes, in this case, it takes positional params. The first parameter has to be a type of integer. The second parameter has to be a string, but it's optional, and the rest gets slurped in and has to validate as integers. And then when we call that validator code ref with @_ it returns all of those values validated for you. The bar function that I have here on screen below is a lot like that, except here we've got named parameters instead of positional ones. So param1 is the first and only named parameter that it takes, has to be a string, and the results of that code ref go into a hash instead of a list of variables. Any questions? Okay. Params validate can return objects too, just like type params compile OO function did. So here's that add contact to database rewritten for params validation compiler. I'm even using standard types from type tiny, just to show you that they play nice together. Here we're calling validation for, we say we've got named params of DBH, ID, and name. We're setting getters and predicates just like type params allows you to do. And in this case, we set an additional option called return object. And when that's set to true, the validator that it compiles will return an object. Here we're putting it into my arg. And from there, it works just like the example I gave earlier with type params. You call the parameters you got as methods. So it's an alternative. If you, my take on this is, this is kind of like type tiny, except it allows you to use other types of type libraries. You don't just have to use type tiny type libraries. So if that's what you prefer, go with Params Validation Compiler. Any questions?
Actually, it's more of a comment. I mean, that code looks identical to the slider two behind you before.
Yes, it does.
It's almost identical.
Yeah, it's this is how Perl and CPAN is. There's just more than one way to do it. In fact, that's what I have on the next slide here. There's more than one way to do it.
The similarity makes sense because if you're putting forward your module recommended as a replacement for another one, you'd want to make it as easy to adopt as possible. So have the same interface if you don't have a reason to be different. Makes it easy to switch in.
Yeah, although it's worth pointing out that Params Validation Compiler's interface is a little bit different than type params. It has these keys called it's got a key called params where you pass it the specification that you want to validate against, and that's how you pass it other options like return object or something like that. Whereas type params, if I go back a couple steps, takes takes options by using a well, actually, I don't have options on here. I think it takes them as a leading hash ref. But other than that, yeah, it looks pretty much the same. You with a little bit of adjustment from of your code, you could port from one to the other pretty easily. So yeah, like I said, this is Perl. There's more than one way to do it, and we have lots of other modules that do things that do method signature or not method function signatures and type validation, which we're not going to get into because otherwise we would be here all night. Here are some examples. You've got Dios, which is by Damian Conway. It is more than just signatures and types. It's a completely new syntax for object-oriented programming, and it uses inside-out objects. It's Damianware, it's pretty wizardly. So if you want to give that a try, go ahead. You've got Kavorka by Toby Inkster, same guy who did Type Tiny. It also gives you new functions, new syntax like function params does with fun and method. Worth noting though, it says it right in the documentation. It's a work in progress. Some people really like it for what they're doing. I got a couple recommendations on my blog post about using Kavorka. Personally, I wouldn't use it in large production code just because, again, the interface hasn't stabilized yet. There's a method signatures module, which gives you new syntax. Plus, it can use moose and mouse types. It's by Buddy Burden. Unfortunately, it needs a maintainer. It hasn't been updated since 2017. There are still more modules. Maybe we're taking this Tim Towdy thing too far. Method signature simple, which gives you, again, new syntax. It's got simple signatures. It's based on method signatures. Doesn't have types. It's also a bit aged. It's last updated in 2013. You've got the Perl 5i effort that Michael Schwern worked on about 5 years ago. It adds lots of features. It in one shot, it gives you all these Cpan modules and new syntax for calling them, including new syntax for functions and methods. Doesn't have type validation though. You've got the signatures Pragma. It's on Cpan. It's not the experimental feature, even though it's in lowercase. It looks like a Pragma. So if you want your modules to look like Pragmas, here you go. It supports simple signatures, kind of like experimental signatures does, and just like experimental signatures, no type validation. And you've got sub-signatures, which is a source filter by Curtis Poe, also known as Ovid. Some people don't like source filters, so if that's you, you're already moving on. But it does have interesting support for multi-dispatch. Other languages have this where, depending upon the parameters you pass a method or function, it calls different code. So you pass it a string, you get one set of code. You pass it an integer, you get another function, etc. So sub-signature supports that. So if you want to go with that model, maybe that's for you. It also does simple signatures. Again, kind of like the experimental signatures feature. You can't mix signatures for methods and functions in the same package. Either you're going to have methods or you're going to have functions. That's just by nature of it being a source filter. It also doesn't have types, and it was last updated in 2005. So that's getting on in age now. That's 16 years ago. Again, maybe we're taking this Tim Towdy thing a little too far. Any questions? Any questions about the whole presentation? Anything that? Yes, please.
I mentioned this in the comments, but if you had a few minutes to like pull it up, I actually released a Cpan module in this area, which possibly predates everything that you mentioned here, and had a number of features in common. Like I released its class param parser. I released it in the year 2000, so it was a year earlier than the ones that you started with, and had a lot of similar features.
Oops, I'm sorry I missed it.
Well, I mean, it wasn't I don't think it really got any uptake, but it did seem to, but it's still there, and it did seem to predate everything else.
Okay, well, I'll cover that. I'll be sure to cover that in either I'll update the blog article or I'll make a new one that says these are the things I missed.
But yeah, so just a brief, do you guys probably, if you guys have been around for a while, you guys probably remember the Cgipm module, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my module was actually inspired by that in a good way. Basically, one of the things about Cgipm is that a number of its methods, including like the param one or whatever for getting CGI parameters, it was very versatile in or also the methods for generating HTML. They were quite versatile, taking a mixture of positional and named and various aliases and with or without dashes and all sorts of stuff. And I basically made this module so just to allow any module to have that kind of flexibility. So it took a fairly simple spec. It took a relatively simple spec and a number of options, but you could then basically make routines which took all these various options, and then it all normalized it into either a hash ref or an array ref. And a lot of the modules, it did not do any type checking, but it seems to have basically done the same thing that a lot of the things you did showed, with some similar syntax, but it did it first.
Okay, cool. And that was class params what?
If you look in the chat, it's class : param parser. I think the main strike.
Got it.
I think the main strike against it is that it was not really picked up by anybody, so it did not become popular like a lot of these other ones. That could be why it was easily missed. However, that aside, it did seem to have a lot of things in common, and it came earlier.
Cool.
And it probably works. It requires Perl 5.004, and it probably works on every version unchanged. I haven't updated it for a long time, but I don't think it broke either.
Okay.
Anyway.
Cool. Well, again, that's another option for you if you want to go on CPAN and look up class param parser. It has those features that Darren described.
I should probably clarify though that I'm mainly bringing this up for hubris. Like, although it works, I'm not specifically recommending that you use it over the other options. Okay.
Well, fair enough. If we're going to plant a flag somewhere as to who did this first, if yours is a year earlier than Params Validate, then you get the flag.
Because practically speaking, it's just a yet another, and there's no compelling reason to use it over the other ones.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, thank you for doing this talk. First of all, I appreciate it. I've got a couple of guys from my team in here too. Had a quick question for you. I hate to just kind of dump another module in here that you haven't talked about, but the Modulicious framework has a Mojo validator module that I wondered if you'd had any experience, or anybody has had any experience with their validator, and how it might compare to any of these.
I'll say I don't have any experience with it. I haven't. I dove into Modulicious a little bit for writing microservices. So maybe if it's using Mojo Validator internally, then I guess I'm a consumer of it. But I haven't looked at it as a separate module for my own projects. Can you give me a idea of what it does and how it does it?
Well, it appears to have a compilation step and a similar grammar to some of these others. I don't actually have a lot of experience using it either. The documentation is, like a lot of Modulicious stuff, can be a little light on examples. So yeah, I'm not real sure. I don't have an opinion. I was just wondering, if you're already in that framework, sticking with the first party kind of support there is good, or if one of these other modules might be more efficient.
Well, that would be an interesting, an interesting topic to cover. I'm furiously writing down future blog article ideas here, and one thing that we desperately need is sort of a Neil Bowers complete survey with benchmarks. So that would be a good thing. How does Mojo Validator compare against Params validation compiler or type params or things like that?
Yes, thanks. I agree. I think when we're talking about introducing some code into a subcall that may do as much as create an entire object every time, it obviously can be a huge amount of overhead. So that would be awesome if you wanted to consider doing that.
Definitely. So yeah, I mean, if I'm trying to publish these articles, I'm trying to publish a new one once a week. I've done it for 3 weeks now, so I'm trying to keep up that kind of pace. If you want to follow my blog at phoenixtrap.com or follow me on Twitter, I'll be I'll try to cover this and maybe some other things that people are interested in with Perl. Any other questions, comments? Okay, well, if that's it, I'll turn the mic back over to George and Julian.